everybody, and welcome to episode 19 of Pod Hacks Only and episode 1 of the Pod Hacks Only YouTube channel. This felt like a perfect episode to start to do the YouTube channel and to kind of transition in that because they're being recorded separately, as episode 19 is already out in the podcast form and is out for anyone to go listen to. And you can find that on the Anchor app. You can find that on my Instagram, Just A Reyes. You can go to justareyes.com, also find it there. You can type in Pod Hacks Only into Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, Overcast, all those things where it's available. And it's going to be a little bit different than this one. So if you wanted to go listen to that one, feel free to do so. The timeline itself will more or less be the same, but the updates as far as they go and the build-up is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit quicker in the YouTube version of this episode for a couple reasons. One, because this is my first YouTube one, so the sound is going to be different. It's not going to be as good as the podcast version, right? I'm not able to use my microphone as I am, because I have to record on my phone because it has a much better camera than my iPad does, and those things will be remedied as we move forward. Also, I'm still learning the transition part of the podcasting, so I'm definitely still learning the transition part of the YouTube side. So this is going to be the first one. I don't want to call it a beta test because I'm actually going to publish. It's going to be out there, but it kind of is that where I'm learning all this thing on my own, right? This isn't a team. I don't have a background in this. I don't have a group of people working on it. It's me doing this, right? I'm doing the research. I'm writing the scripts. I'm recording it. I'm editing it, and I'm putting it out there. And I've learned so much. And if you listen to Pod Hacks, you know that going from episode 1 to episode 19, where we're at, the show has grown quite a bit in that time frame. And I'm hoping that the YouTube version kind of does the same thing. And I'm also hoping the YouTube version helps get the show out there to more people, because whether they like it or not, podcasting is growing and it's a continually evolving industry, and it's one that I very much enjoy being a part of, and I don't intend on getting rid of the podcast for the YouTube version at all. I mean, I'm going to do both of them, and they may end up being different, right? There's going to be a lot of episodes that are going to be recorded at the same time, so they're going to be the same. There's going to be some like this that are recorded at different times. There's going to be some that I record just for the podcast. There's going to be some that I record just for YouTube. But people like to listen to different things on, they like to use different mediums, right? Some people like the video version of YouTube. YouTube is obviously, it's been extremely popular for some time now. So it just makes sense to get it out there on YouTube to kind of help get this out to more people, because I do enjoy doing it. And the more people that come and listen and show support, the more I can do and the longer I can do it for. So please remember to like and subscribe. Right, and if you want to go back to the other podcast and listen there and like and subscribe there, I'm more than happy with that as well. But like and subscribe to this channel, and you will know again when I update more videos. And I'm going to try to keep it pretty consistent. I'm going to try to do this weekly if my schedule allows it. Right now, I know that most of the world is kind of stopped for this coronavirus outbreak. My job has not stopped at this time. It may stop in the near future, but at the time it hasn't stopped. And I also got a couple other things that are happening on top of this. But I do have this episode, again, it's queued up. It's already out. There's 19 podcast episodes out. If you want to go check those out for plenty of content for the time being. I have episode 20, which would be episode 2 of the YouTube version, pretty much on deck. It's got to button up a couple things. And episode 21 also, I just have to transition a lot of my notes onto the devices that I use so that I can set it up to record both at the same time. So I have a bunch of episodes that are ready to go that I'm going to be sending out here pretty soon. I hope you guys enjoy it. And episode 20 will be, if you listen to the podcast version, you know that I was making my way through the league, going 5 teams at a time, starting with the worst 5 teams in the league. And episode 18 was the 5 teams, the best 5 that didn't make the playoffs. So episode 20 will be the 5 teams on the American League side of the playoffs, where episode 22 will be the 5 teams on the National League side of the playoffs. And I do the American League side, then the National League side, only because the Nationals won, which means the National League side won. So we're going to use that side, even though there's teams with better records on the American League side, because the National League team had the World Series champion on it. That's the side we're going to give the final episode to in the rundown to the league. And my hopes were to get it out before opening day, and that seems to be the case for reasons outside of the ones that I hoped for. I hope that I was already ready, getting all these notes going. And then the spring training episode came up, and it actually ended up turning into 2 episodes. So I have this episode going on the timeline of spring training and how it became what it is today. And then I have another episode, episode 21, which will be on 6 stadiums in spring training history. And I picked these 6 for specific reasons. I wanted to do 3 Arizona teams, 3 Florida teams. That's not as easy to do because Florida, as you will see in the timeline, has just been doing it for so much longer. So it's 4 Florida teams and our stadiums and 2 Arizona stadiums. And I really do hope you guys enjoy that episode and all the information that's gonna be coming out of that, because there's a lot of good information. I love history and I love baseball, so they kind of fit right into my wheelhouse. I've been having a lot of fun researching those things. But again, before we get started, please like and subscribe. If you need to reach me, you can reach me info@justareyes.com. You can reach me on my Instagram, justareyes, and you can also reach me at info.justareyes@gmail.com, and I'll have all those in the episode description. But let's get into a quick update around the league, and then we'll get into the timeline. Okay, the updates for this one are going to be a lot different. Well, they're definitely going to be different than the ones that we covered in the podcast version. So if you want to listen to those updates, and those updates, I went over the Christian Yelich deal, I went over the Yoan Moncada deal, I went over all the injuries that are happening with the Yankees, as well as updates to what's happening with Chris Sale in his third opinion on his throwing arm. I also went over Trevor Bauer and his back and forth with Manfred. But we need to do new updates for the obvious reason, right? The postponement of the season. If you follow me on Instagram, I already put out a quick video to discuss it, but I'll go in a little bit more depth here. The Major League Baseball decided last week that they were going to stop spring training pretty much right in the middle of it, right? Games were supposed to start, today's 18th, next week. Opening day was supposed to be the end of next week, I believe, or maybe the beginning of the week after. But still, here in the next 10 days, or so, the opening day was supposed to happen. 5-6 days ago, Major League Baseball decided spring training, not only spring training going to stop right in the middle of it, but opening day was going to be pushed back at least 2 weeks. And even at the time, that 2 weeks seemed a little bit more of like a pipe dream than reality. And that's just become more and more of the case. As opening day, all the rumors are, well, it's probably not gonna happen in April, and then it went to maybe it'll happen in May. Now it's probably not gonna happen in May. Maybe it happened in June, and then there's even grumblings of maybe it happens in July, or maybe the season just gets canceled this year. And I think all of those options are on the table, but the reality is nobody really knows. Chances are what's going to happen is if they do play this year, they're going to have to do a 2-week build-up for players, right, to get back in strength, because they're not training at this time. They're all quarantined in different areas. They're not hanging out with their trainers. They're not warming up. They're not gearing up like they were during spring training. And as we see in this episode, spring training, that's what the purpose of spring training is. It's to build up strength and knock the rust off after a 5, 6, maybe even 7-month layoff for these players, and get ready for the grind of a long 162-game season. They're not going to get that really. So again, they're going to need at least a week, if not 2, to get their body back in motion. And then when they do begin to start playing, the chances are they're probably going to do at least a couple weeks worth, if not a month or so worth, of no fans in the stadium. And that's just kind of how it's going to go. The NBA, the NHL probably going to do the same thing. That's what's happening. And I say that because that's what was on the table before Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz tested positive and kind of put a stop to all gatherings and sporting events, right? Right after that happened, the NBA and NHL suspended action, and the MLB followed suit by getting rid of spring training and postponing the start date. And what we're seeing now is in China, where it kind of broke out, right in Asia, where it initially broke out, the coronavirus. Those leagues are starting to get back to playing, but they're doing it with no fans. And that's probably what's going to happen here in America as well. When that happens, nobody really knows. There's no real timetable. right? The whole purpose of these quarantines and the stopping of these gatherings of people, right? Stoppings of concerts and travel and all those things is to kind of spread out the coronavirus as long as they can, because if they have everybody coming at once, just the medical personnel just couldn't handle it, and that's the reality of it. And that's what's happening in Italy and Spain, is that there's too many people with COVID-19 and not enough hospital beds and medical personnel, especially when the medical personnel are getting sick. That's what they're trying to prevent in the United States, and that's why they're trying to drag it along. That's the point of these quarantines. They're not because the apocalypse is coming. It's not because it's the end of the world. You don't need to go run and fight people for toilet paper and for water and food and all those different things. No, you just need to be cautious and careful. And if you're told to be quarantined, be quarantined. If you're told to work from home, work from home. The social distancing thing is for a reason, right? Is the COVID-19 going to just wipe through and kill everybody in its wake? No, it's a very, very tiny percentage of people that have passed away from COVID-19. And it could be an even smaller percentage if we're able to spread it out where the medical field and the medical personnel can handle the rate in which people are coming in for this virus. And that's the reason for that. And as you're seeing it now, right, teams are sending their players home. And a big part of it was teams were told initially that they can either stay in their spring training site, they can go back to their home city where they live in the off season, or they can go to where they play during the regular season. Some people it's the same thing, right? They live and play in the same city. Not everybody's like that. So they were given those options. And that kind of ended when a minor leaguer from the Yankees tested positive for COVID-19. The rest of the Yankees were put in quarantine in their hotels. They were delivered food and all those things. And another one was tested positive for it. And my guess is that the rest of the league is going to be starting tested to see who has it, who doesn't have it. And everyone is pretty much going to be quarantined. There is some good that has happened from it. Minor leaguers are the ones that you have to worry about the most, them and game day personnel, right? Because most major leaguers, they have the money. They have the money and the resources. It's not a big deal to them in that regard, right? I mean, it's a big deal to everybody, but in that regard, as far as how they're going to live financially, they're not too worried about it. Who is worried about it is the game day personnel that relies on those checks every year. They don't get paid in the offseason, right? Major leaguers don't get paid in the offseason. They get paid game day checks from when they play. If they're not playing, they're not getting paid. And that goes for minor leaguers, that goes for the game day staff. And they don't make nearly the amount of money as major leaguers do, naturally. So what happens with minor leaguers who haven't been paid since August? With game day personnel who hasn't been paid since September or October, depending on where they work. They rely on those checks to come at this time to get by, right? I mean, you can only save up and last for so long before you got to wait. Some of them do work off-season jobs, right? But I mean, those only go so far. You can't work permanent jobs and then say, all right, peace, I can't see you for the next 6 months because I'm focusing on baseball. It doesn't work that way. So they got to work little odds and end jobs. As you'll see major leaguers just do in the past, they have to do that now. So Major League Baseball, there has been a few teams that have come out to say they were going to pay all their minor leaguers. The Dodgers, the Mets, the Red Sox, I want to say the Rays were one of those teams. But there was 4 or 5 of them, and I'm imagining the rest of the teams are going to kind of start to follow suit to do that as well. It's not their fault that this is happening, and you need to take care of them because you're pretty much paying them anyways, right? You're not paying them for what the product they're putting on the field because minor league teams don't bring in that much revenue. You're paying them to play and to stay in shape and to stay at the ready, just in case they become available to play. And a lot of them, truth be told, they're paid to be pretty much sparring partners for future major leaguers because most of them aren't going to make it to the major leagues. So they're paid to allow those guys that are going to make it to the league to have somebody to play against that is of somewhat decent talent. And if one of those guys that was hired to be a sparring partner becomes a major leaguer, that's a win for them. So they're already kind of paid to be there anyways. So it wouldn't hurt major league teams to do so. So I hope the rest of the league follows suit. One thing that the whole league has done in conjunction together, which has been a good thing, is all of them have donated $1 million apiece at least $1 million a piece for $30 million to pay all game day staff across the major leagues. And that, again, is a great thing that's come out of this. So that's the updates right now. We don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to be an abbreviated season? We don't know. Our game's going to be canceled? We don't know. Is the season going to be canceled? We don't know. What's going to happen with the All-Star game? What's going to happen with people's contracts, right? You have people that are going to try to make that 10-year. They want to make that. They want to get to the 10-year, and this is the year that they're going to make it. Are they going to be given it, or are they going to have to wait one more year, right? One more year could mean anything. It really is a gamble every time you go out there and play, right? And then you have other guys that baseball is one of those unique things that when you come in the league, you don't get paid that money, right? You're still kind of paid at the lower end. And then you go into arbitration years, right? But that's, 4 or 5 years down the line. You do a few years of arbitration, and then you're finally eligible for free agency where you can make that big payday. Does that cut into that time? Do they have to do that at 1 year older than they were initially going to do it? That could be millions and millions of dollars for these people. So what do they do with that? What do they do with guys like Mookie Betts, right? The Dodgers traded all these people for Mookie Betts. He's only under contract for 1 year. Does that contract move over to next year if they don't play? Do they only get him for basically it becomes half a season? Nobody knows. What happens to the incentives that are built into these contracts, right? People get paid more for the amount of innings they pitch, for the amount of strikeouts they get, for the amount of home runs, hits, batting average. If they make the playoffs and make the All-Star game. Nobody knows. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. What we do know, as I mentioned, is that some teams are going to be playing their minor leaguers no matter what. We do know that the start date is not going to happen in April. There's not going to be no baseball played in April. We know that's going to happen. We know that the teams are going to be paying their game day staff. So those are some positives as far as the game day staff and the minor leaguers go. But the rest of it we don't know, and that's the disheartening part. That's the struggle that we're having right now. But that's kind of an across the nation thing, right? Baseball is an important distraction. That's what sports are. They're a great distraction for us. They're entertainment, and I want to say this should be the last thing on your brain, right? There's a lot of things you should be worried about over that. But if there's ever a time that the world needs a distraction, it's now. So this is tough to see. Like you're seeing all the MLS, you're seeing La Liga, you're seeing the Euros. All of them get suspended or canceled. The NCAA is getting canceled. It's a crazy time for the world and for the sports, bro. So that'll do it for the updates on here. I'm going to get into the timeline here in a second, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm going to try not to breeze through it in one fell swoop, but it may be a little bit quicker than I do the podcast version. Hey everybody, there is no sponsor. This is the YouTube version. At least not yet. We'll get some sponsors in the future, but I wanted to just take this brief intermission between the intro and the opening of the episode to tell everybody to stay safe, that we were all thinking about you and my family. If there's anything anybody needs, I know there's not a lot we can do at this time, but please reach out to us. Even if you just want to chat or if you just want to talk, this is going to be a challenging time for everybody in the country and across the world. So just stay strong, right? Make sure you guys are prepared. Make sure you guys are in contact with the people you need to be in contact with. And again, if you guys need to just talk to somebody, if you chat, anything, you guys have my email in the episode description. A lot of you that are close friends, you guys have my number. And same goes for my wife and my daughter. We are here for all of you. So stay strong. Remember that family is one of the most important things right now. So take care of your family and take care of yourselves. And hopefully we'll be out of this and into baseball here pretty soon. So what is spring training? Spring training is, again, it's an opportunity for players to knock the rust off, right? They got 5-6 months off after they play games, right? Because some people's season ends at the end of September. Some of them end in October. Some of them end as early as August, right? Or July if you're hurt, depending on what injuries do. So you're waiting from that point on all the way until they start reporting in the middle of February, end of February, and spring training begins end of February, beginning of March. So that's a pretty long layoff, especially when you consider they're playing 162 games from April to September. That's a short time frame to play a lot of games. So you have to get up to speed. And if you're spending 5-6 months of doing, you're doing some workouts, but you're not really ramping it up yet because your body does need rest after that that marathon of a season. That's what the seasons are, right? They're marathons. They're not sprints in Major League Baseball. The postseason is a sprint. The season is a marathon, and it takes a lot of training to gear up for a marathon. And even marathon runners, right? They set up, okay, here, we're going to set up, we're going to train for our marathon. They train for those months, they run the marathon, and then you need time for your body to rest and recover. That's what the off season is. Then you need to get back and gear up again, and that's what spring training is for from the player side. From the ownership side, it is marketable, right? Just plain and simple, it's become extremely marketable because it's become extremely popular. Because spring training is awesome. You get to go to a lot less stressful environment. You get to pull up to a game. You get to kick back and watch your favorite major leaguers. You get to watch the up and coming players. You get to watch the top prospects play, future major leaguers. They have their own merchandise now. This is the Colorado Rockies hat from this year. I also own the Dodgers hat from this year. I usually get the Dodger hat every year. So they make jerseys that they sell. They make different hats they sell. It's just all kinds of different things they got going on. It's definitely marketable franchise, and that's why we've had a few new stadiums come in the last few years. I would imagine there's going to be a few more here in the near future, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit. But it's marketable from one side, and the other side for it, from ownership and for them coaching personnel, is that it allows them to evaluate those young guys, those prospects, those maybe them older guys, right? Those guys that they bring in on minor league contracts, guys that have been kind of hanging around a little bit, and they try to figure out, are they, for minor leaguers mainly, are you willing to keep them on the roster, right? Because now you get to keep 26 people. It's probably going to be 13 pitchers, 13 position players. May shift one or two here or there, depending on the team, but they're probably going to stay in that 13 range. Are they good enough to make that top 26? Are you going to use them enough to keep them that top 26? Or do you want them to stay down in AAA, and have you seen enough of them to know that they're not going to be in AAA very long before you call them up? And this is the chance to really get to see them up close and personal, because during the regular season, you don't get those opportunities, right? Minor leaguers don't play as many games. Their season isn't as long. And you're up there in a long marathon of a season with your major league team. You don't have the time to go down there and scout them. So this is your opportunity to see them up close and personal, to have conversations with them, to see how they fit with the team, to do those different things. And then you have the veterans, right? Would you rather have that veteran on the team at the time? What does he do for you, right? And some of them have panned out pretty well for teams. And Justin Turner is probably the greatest example of that right now. He was with the Mets, but he wasn't. He had quick hands, but he wasn't that great of a bat. His glove was okay, and the Mets pretty much just let him go. The Dodgers bring him in on a minor league contract, and I think you can say the rest is history, right? And the only reason the Dodgers brought him in was because he was from LA. I think he played for Cal State Fullerton, and one of his former coaches, or at least an alumni who knew him really well, happened to be working with the Dodgers at that time. Told them to take a runner on him. They did, and it's paid off wonders. So those things can happen, right? But you don't know unless you get an opportunity to actually look at him. And you're not going to throw a guy in like that in the middle of the regular season. No, it's going to be something like spring training that's a lot less stressful, right? Players aren't playing that many innings, so you're getting a lot of people that can rotate into games. You have not only the games going on there, you have multiple side fields where games are going on. You got batting practice happening all the time. You get a lot of different opportunities to evaluate different talent, to make sure that when the season starts and throughout the course of the season, you're putting your best 26 in the field at all times, right? Because you're gonna have injuries, you're gonna have players that are gonna develop a little bit that you may think they're not ready now, but come June, July they may be, right? Come October or September they may be a great call opportunity as the rosters expand. They used to expand to 40, now they expand to 26 to 28, so only 2 more roster spots, starting with the 2020 season. Well, probably starting with the 2021 season more likely. It's you want to have your best foot forward when push comes to shove, and spring is a big part of evaluating that. So that's the main purpose of spring training. So we're just getting into the timeline here. Let's talk about how it started. So let's do that. Let me start by apologizing if there's not much transitions or if it's a little bit sloppy. This is my first one, so I'm learning this. I don't have any background in this. I just want to do this because I want to learn. I think it's fun, right? And I have a lot of good information. I think I can do a really good job at presenting a lot of information to you guys in an entertaining way, and helping you guys understand baseball and just spreading the game that I love in a fun way for me and for you guys. So I'm sorry if the transitioning and everything is a little bit sloppy right now. I promise you it will get better over time. So how did spring training start? When did it start? Well, there's an argument between historians. There's two different dates that people argue. I'm going to argue a different one. So some people think that in 1870, when the Red Stockings of Cincinnati and the White Stockings of Chicago held an organized baseball game in New Orleans, that was the start of spring training. But it was kind of a quick game, and then they were out of there. And that was in 1870. So they argue that in 1870. The other half of baseball stories argue that when the Washington Capitals, the National League at the time, pioneered spring training in 1888, they held a 4-day camp in Jacksonville. So they actually had a camp, but they didn't really play any games. It was just kind of them down there warming up for 4 days. So, I mean, I guess you can kind of say that's an abbreviated spring training of 4 games. They didn't really have as many teams at the time either, right? In 1888, I think there was like 10 teams, maybe 7. There wasn't a whole lot. So, and at the time, you did have the American League and the National League, and they didn't play each other. They were even more so separated than they are today. But after that 1888 season, it would be 15 years before anyone would spend a full spring in Florida. So they were the first kind of going to Florida. They were 15 years ahead of everybody else. My argument is in that same year, in 1888, Gus Schmelz of the Boston Red Stockings, he was their manager. He petitioned the owner, Aaron Stearns, to allow the team to train down south during the spring, right? And part of the position was, so the players will play half of the proceeds, ownership pays half the proceeds, and then we'll split whatever revenue whatever we come with. They didn't necessarily have a camp though. What they wanted to do, what the players wanted to do, and this is the only reason kind of they wanted to do it, was for barnstorming. Barnstorming was the thing that changed spring training in general. This is what brought spring training about, was barnstorming. We kind of owe it to that. And what is barnstorming? Well, barnstorming is kind of like the theaters that used to go and travel, and they used to perform in the barns, right? At this time in the late 1800s and even in the early 1900s, most local towns and cities had their own baseball teams, right? You had the professional teams in some cities, but almost every town in America had baseball teams. You had people traveling there. I mean, this is why it was America's pastime. People loved to play it. So you had local teams, kind of like you have local slow pitch softball teams. Well, you had local baseball teams, right? That was what people did. They loved to do it. So the major leaguers decided, you know what would be a cool idea? Let's head down south. Let's travel between these towns. We'll play baseball in front of them. They get to see major leaguers, and we get to get showered with love, and we get to kind of just party our way through the South all the way back in to start the season. And so, and that sounds like, again, it sounds like an awesome idea. I would love to do that. So I get the appeal of it, and that's what the players wanted. But that's not why I think that this is the real start of spring training. The ownership side of it, Aaron Stern, the owner of the Red Stockings at the time, he decided to go with it because he thought this would be a great opportunity to evaluate his younger players, decide if whether it's good enough to keep them or to keep growing them, or if they just weren't ready or they just weren't going to make it eventually. It's also an opportunity for him to evaluate his veterans and, again, put his best foot forward when the season starts, which is kind of exactly what they do now from the ownership side of it. So this is why I kind of think that might be the more legitimate start to it, although it wasn't an actual camp, but games were being played. So, I mean, you can flip a coin and pick whichever one you want. But that definitely started the trend, right, in that 1888 season. It would help things moving forward. At the time when the Red Stockings were barnstorming in the Capitol, or the Nationals, were they the Capitals at the time, I'm sorry, and they were having that 4-day camp in Jacksonville, almost every team was pretty much out east at this time, because everything was out east. Things were slowly moving out west, right? And it really wasn't until the 50s, 60s when the West Coast got started. So it's going to be very east heavy, and that's why Florida has much more history than Arizona has, right? I mean, the Dodgers and Giants didn't start the trend of having teams on the West Coast until they moved there in the mid-50s. So at this time, everything is East Coast, and a lot of them were in the northern East Coast. There wasn't any teams in Florida or down south, right? I don't think there was any teams in Atlanta at the time. I think Philadelphia was the southernmost team, but I could be wrong. I don't know if St. Louis started at that time, but so most of them though, even if they were in St. Louis or Philadelphia, they're playing in frigid weather, right? In March, Arizona and Florida are beautiful weather. That's the best time of year to go there before it gets too hot, too muggy, all those things. The weather's kind of perfect, so that's why they ended up started going down there. But when you're in the north, right, especially on the northeastern edge of the country, it gets cold. It's colder in March. You get a little bit more rain. You get you could even get snow in some parts during some years, and they would have to warm up a little bit. So they did a little bit of spring warming up, right? People were working on the side as well, and they would just have to play indoors when weather got bad. So teams, after hearing about barnstorming in the South, being able to play in much better weather and play different teams. What? Sorry about that.
Sorry. I'm talking to myself.
After hearing about what barnstorming is, and I mean, it had to have spread. The Red Stockings players had to start telling different teams how much fun they had and how awesome it was to be treated like royalty as they played these local teams in the South. It started to become more and more of an idea. Ownership started to see it as more and more of an opportunity to evaluate their players. They thought that was a great idea. And they started to head down south to play in states like Arkansas, Mississippi, and Georgia. And they would just kind of make their way. They start in the South and they'd make their way back up to where they play. Then they start the season. 1890, most teams are now training on the road. So it took 2 years after that 88 season for teams to think, hey, you know what? That's a good idea. I want a part of that. And they would just play against, again, local college teams, semi-pro teams, which were all over at the time. And then because there was more big league teams down there playing, they would also play against each other here and there. Players spend the majority of their time, though, and this is the toughest part of it, traveling via train, because that was the best form of transportation, right? Cars really weren't built for all that travel at the time. The roads really weren't built everywhere. They didn't have roads everywhere. You're not going to be on a horse and buggy. So the best form of transportation was trains, and they didn't have a whole lot of places to stay either. So it was just training back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, which could have got exhausted for a lot of players. So in 1903, all right, 15 years after that 88 season, the Philadelphia Athletics, right, because they were in Philly at the time, and you'll see a lot of these team names change cities and they changed names. So there was the Philadelphia Athletics in 1903. They would hold a full training camp in Jacksonville, Florida. But after they finished that year with a disappointing record, I think they finished third in their division last year, which wasn't what they should have done due to their talent. Then coach, the legendary Connie Mack, he would blame the weather in Jacksonville during the spring, and they wouldn't return to Jacksonville for another 11 years in 1914. Although after 1914, they stayed there until 1918, and they would bounce around multiple locations, including Mexico City in 1937, and then they settled in Mesa, Arizona in 1969, and that's where the Oakland A's played a day after they moved to Oakland. A side note on that, they're not the only team to play in Mexico City. In fact, they weren't the first team to do it. So they did it in 1937. The Chicago White Stockings played in Mexico City in 1907. So they were playing in Mexico City all the way back in 1907. From what I've seen and what I've researched, they were the only two teams to do so, but they weren't the only two teams to play spring training outside the country, and we'll kind of get into that in a second. 1905, the Chicago Cubs became the first team to head out west and train in Santa Monica, California, because why wouldn't you, man? Chicago in March, or you can go to the mugginess, or you can go to the beautiful California, which at the time wasn't really populated, right? And people were just barely making their way out there. So you had plenty of real estate, and California is beautiful when it's not overpopulated. And so they made their way out there, and they did spring training there for a little bit. And then from 1922 to 1942, and then in 1950 and 1951, they were traded on the Catalina Islands in California. So they had prime real estate for spring training for quite a while. And I know there's a gap there in the 40s. You're going to see why here in a second. In 1909, the Chicago White Sox became the first team to train in Arizona, and that was because they held camp in California, and they were barnstorming their way back to Chicago, and they just made their way through Arizona. And 1909 was actually the year that Arizona became a state, so they got a kind of a double whammy there in Arizona. 1910, the following year, spring training they found out was marketable. I mean, eventually they were going to find out it's marketable. Most things they don't just do things for free; they want to make money off of it. And spring training was an easy one. So that happened in 1910, and most teams though they encamp east of the Mississippi. So again, most of this happened on the East Coast, and the Grapefruit League became a formal league. Although, as I mentioned, most of them weren't playing in Florida; they were playing in Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, some even in Texas. In those ways before they start to kind of really settle into Florida. 1913, the Cubs would train in Tampa, Florida, right? They went to California, and they went to Florida before heading back to California in the 20s. And then that kind of started the trend, though, right? So they started the trend of kind of heading out west. Then they started setting the trend to head into Florida. They did that in 1913 in Tampa. And the following year, 1914, the St. Louis Browns, the St. Louis Cardinals, and the Philadelphia Athletics would join the Cubs in Florida. Branch Rickey was the manager of the Browns at the time, and yes, the St. Louis Browns. The Browns were originally the Milwaukee Brewers in 1900, and they moved to St. Louis in 1901. So that's in Milwaukee for a year, and then the Milwaukee Brewers didn't get a team for 70 years, I think. I think it was the 70s, and we'll get into that in this timeline as well. And they would stay in St. Louis before moving to Baltimore in 1953 before becoming the Orioles. The New York Yankees were the original Baltimore Orioles, right? So the Browns may have become the Orioles in 53. Well, the Yankees were the Baltimore Orioles from 1901 to 1903 before moving up to New York and becoming the Yankees. Because teams, and you'll see, teams really didn't get settled in until the 70s, 80s. And then we had more expansion teams added in the 90s. So the league as we know it, and I mean, even the Expos moving to Washington in the early 2000s, the league as we know it really didn't happen until the early 2000s and the 90s. So it took a long time. It took 100 years before we finally started to get settled into what we have right now. And news with the Oakland A's and the Tampa Rays, maybe we're not as settled as we think we are. But that might be for a future episode. 1920, the Washington Nationals moved to Tampa for spring training, and they're still there today, although, again, they've moved different franchises. They would later become the Washington Senators and then become the Minnesota Twins, and they also still train in Florida. 1925, the New York Yankees would move to St. Petersburg, Florida, and they would stay in Florida outside of a few years in the 40s. Again, we'll touch on that soon, and then a brief year in Arizona, and we'll get into that. 1928 to 1929, the Red Sox will move to Bradenton, Florida's 9th Street Park, formerly City Park, and that's going to be one of the parks that we're going to cover in episode 21. There's a lot of rich history to that, and that is still being used today by the Pittsburgh Pirates. From 1923 is when it was built, all the way till today, it's still being used. There's a lot of rich history in that stadium. That's going to be part of that episode. And they would stay in Florida outside of a year in Savannah, Georgia, and then a few years in the 40s again. 1929, by that time, right when the Red Sox were there, 10 of the 16 teams in the majors would be played in Florida. So it didn't take long for the Cubs to set that trend, right? 1913, it took the league pretty much 16 years for the majority of them to start settling into Florida, realizing that's the best location because, well, you have the beaches there. Florida's probably the best spot to go to. 1929 also had the Detroit Tigers become the first team to officially hold their spring training in Arizona. They played several local teams at Phoenix Riverside Park, and then they left to California in 1913, and they would never come back to Arizona again. So they were the first one to camp there, and they're not one of the 15 teams. And it's not because they're an East Coast team, because as you'll see, one of the best things about spring training is it's the Grapefruit League and the Cactus League aren't NL and AL specific. They're not East Coast and West Coast specific. There's a nice blend of a lot of different teams, and so that makes it pretty nice for baseball fans alike to go to a centralized location, see a lot of different teams that they may not get an opportunity to see during the regular season. 1934, the Cubs would end up in Lakeland, Florida, where they would remain outside those years in the 40s. And let's get into those years in the 40s after a quick juicy gem is what we call it during the podcast.
It's time for Juicy Gems.
Okay, the juicy gem for the YouTube episode is going to be similar to the one I used during the podcast. The one I used during the podcast was mic'd up players. And it's similar in the sense to the one I'm going to talk about right now because the original idea for mic'd up players came from Trevor Bauer's company, Momentum. Trevor Bauer, of course, is a pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds. He's with the Indians for last year before getting traded at the trade deadline to Cincinnati. Spent a lot of years in Cleveland. They said to mic up players, we got to see a lot of cool different things. To see the baseball side of how their minds work during a game from a major league perspective. And that's something that baseball probably should have done a long time ago. I mean, you look at the NBA and the NFL. I mean, think about all the great that mic'd up players and coaches have done for the NFL. Baseball's behind the times. We're finally getting into there right this year. It's supposed to be the first year that umpires are mic'd up, which is great for the sport. And the big issue we've talked about in the past in the podcast is the marketability of baseball, and this is a step in the right direction. But going to this Juicy Gem, it comes from Trevor Bauer's company, Momentum. Again, things were shut down, right, from the coronavirus. People were told they can stay at spring training at the time. This is before everyone was told they got to come home. They're shutting down spring training sites. He was asked on Twitter by one of the Reds' new relief pitchers if he thought it would be a good idea during this lockdown to do a Sandlot style pickup game, and he said he was 1,000% in or 10,000% in. You can add up all those zeros if you want. And Mike Clevenger joined in, pitcher for the Indians. Derek Dietrich, player for the Reds, joined in, and they had a lot of different major leaguers, and they even had Coach Kent Murphy, which if you don't know who Coach Kent Murphy is, look him up. Although make sure your children aren't around. It's not very safe for children, his language, or for work. But he's very entertaining, and he did the announcing for it on the Instagram page or the Twitter live feed, and they did a Sandlot style wiffle ball game of a bunch of major leaguers. They live streamed it. They all talked to the crowd. It doesn't replace Major League Baseball games being played, but it was a nice little break, and being able to see Major League players go out there and play and have a good time. And that'll be the first installment of the YouTube version of Juicy Gems.
It's time for Juicy Gems.
All right, let's talk about those years in the 40s. September 1st, 1939, World War II began. So I know a lot of history buffs probably already knew where I was going with that. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would start the U.S. involvement in the war, and many players would leave to fight in that war, including Yogi Berra, Jackie Robinson, Joe DiMaggio, Bob Feller, Stan Musial, Warren Spahn, Willie Mays, and so on and so on and so on. And I really want to do an episode on that in the future because a lot of Hall of Famers, I mean, these are legends that are leaving to go fight in the war in the middle of their careers. So that definitely put a halt to a lot of major league type things, including, of course, spring training. A compromise would be made between MLB and the U.S. government in 1943. So pretty much what comes to about a year and a half after that bombing in December by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor. Commissioner at the time was Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and him and Joseph B. Eastman, who was the director of Federal Offices of Defense Transportation, they would come to an agreement that spring training games would be held north of the Potomac and Ohio rivers and east of the Mississippi. And that line is now became known to baseball historians and baseball players at the time as the Landis-Eastman line. And the reason they did that, obviously, is a lot of teams were located there, except for teams like the Cardinals, the White Sox, the Cubs, and the Reds. And they were told they were limited to pick between Missouri for the Cardinals and Browns and Indiana and Illinois for the Cubs and the White Sox. So everyone was pretty much told to stay near where they're at. And a big part of this was, again, trains, right? Early in spring training, trains were a big part of why they weren't really able to camp in one central location because they were constantly going back and forth in trains. Well, trains at this time is still the best form of transportation. There wasn't really very many air carriers or commercial airlines still in existence. So they needed trains to transport people to camps for the military and to transport weapons, supplies, all those different things. And they wanted to cut down on the traffic in those trains. And part of cutting down on the traffic in those trains was professional athletes, because sports at times like this, like we're going through right now, kind of have to take a back seat, and rightfully so. So they came to the agreement to cut those down and make them play near where they're at for that reason. So teams would end up, so the Yankees ended up in Asbury Park, New York. The Red Sox ended up in nearby Tufts College in Medford, Massachusetts, and the Dodgers ended up in Bear Mountain, New York. And I still need to look that up because I hope that stadium still exists, because Bear Mountain, New York sounds like an awesome name. And the Giants ended up in Lakewood, Florida, and other teams ended up just kind of in nearby areas, as I mentioned. The amount of games being played were also limited, so they were used to playing 30 to 35 games. They were limited to 13 games during those springs. And so then the first time since 1919, there was no major league training in the South. They were all done in frigid weather. Dan Daniels of the New York World Telegraph wrote this about that year's spring training. There is no Florida sun. There are no bathing beauties. There are fewer stakes, and it is tougher to get up a perspiration. There are more aches and muscles that never hurt before, squawks against calisthenics. There are dull hours, but there are good beds and long nights in which to rest in them. And I'm sure if you told this to a major leaguer now, they would probably echo those sentiments as they're all being confined to their homes. It's just I'm not comparing this to World War II by any means, but baseball being shut down and players being told they're not allowed to go to where they're normally used to going to during the spring is similar in that sense. So in that small sense, it's similar. But that moves us past the war years, and it didn't start getting back to normal until about 1946. In 1946, the Boston Braves moved to Florida, starting the domino back to Florida. And yes, the Boston Braves. After being bouncing around a few different states, then they're now the Atlanta Braves, and they have never left Florida after that 46 season. In 1947, the Indians and Giants moved to Arizona, really kicking off that trend, right? The Tigers did it in 29 for a season. They really didn't kick off a trend. 1947, the Indians and the Giants would start to move teams towards Arizona. The Giants moved to Phoenix as their owner, Horace Stoneman, was a businessman that had interest in the growing city of Phoenix. Phoenix really wasn't a bustling metropolis like it is now, similar to like LA wasn't a bustling metropolis at this time either, right? That was why Disneyland was able to start going this time and have the property to do so. That's why the Dodgers were able to go get land and build their stadium to get the stadium that they wanted, right? They were getting cramped in New York. Part of the reason why they moved out west. Same with the Giants is moving to San Francisco. So he was a businessman and he saw it as a growing city and had business interests. He said, you know what, I'm going to move my team down here. It's all going to go into one interest. It's about making money. The Indians, on the other hand, moved to Tucson. And their owner, Bill Veeck, was a prominent ranch owner. And with a large ranch near Tucson, he was able to, again, two birds, one stone. They started playing at High Corbett Field, which is another stadium I'm going to cover in episode 21. And I've been to High Corbett Field multiple times. It's now currently being used by the University of Arizona. It's been around again since 1947. It's a very interesting stadium, to say the least. March 8th, 1947, the Giants and Indians played the first of 7 exhibition games that spring to unofficially kicked off the Cactus League. And again, 1947, this is what, 40 years or 30 years after the Grateful League got kicked off. So they're 30 years behind, and they have a lot of catching up to do over these next few years. 1947, the Philadelphia Phillies, and they're finally the Philadelphia Phillies, find a home in Clearwater where they are, and their single A team still play today. And I've been to this original spring training site in Clearwater, and I've actually played on this field a few times during the summer when I was a little bit younger. I think I was 19 at the time. It's a cool little stadium. It's definitely, again, it's not what they're playing in now. Like the stadiums now they're gorgeous facilities, right? And it's a huge camp area. This is not it. So spring training has come such a long way. And if you see it, I'm gonna try to post pictures of it on my Instagram if I can find some. It's nice field, it's a nice facility, but they've come a long way since then. In 1948, the Dodgers moved into a formal naval airstrip in Vero Beach, Florida. And I'm going to cover a lot of that history because it is a cool history. Again, right, it's an airstrip. It's still around today. It was known as Dodger Town for a long time. Dodgers are no longer playing there as of 2011. But it has a cool history. So that's going to be another stadium I'm going to cover in that episode 21. 1951, the New York Yankees trained in Phoenix for a year before going back to Florida. I only put that in there. Same with like the Red Sox training in Phoenix here in the next few years, because it's kind of a cool piece of history. Like the Red Sox and Yankees did play in Arizona at one point. 1953, the Pittsburgh Pirates camp in Havana, Cuba. As I mentioned, there was two teams, right, that played in Mexico, but they wouldn't be the only teams to play outside the country. Well, the Pirates played in Havana, Cuba in 1953, which is crazy to think about. The 5 years before that, they were playing in Hollywood, California, and they now play in Florida. Again, they play in the oldest stadium in all of spring training now. 1954, the Pirates move into the Grapefruit League in Fort Pierce, Florida. So they finally joined in 1954. Also in 1954, the White Sox moved from El Centro, California to Tampa, Florida, joining the Grapefruit League as well. And then you fast forward to 61-62 when the expansion Angels and the Colt 45s joined the Cactus League to give them a little bit more leeway because they were getting their butts, they were getting trounced right now by the Grapefruit League, right? They had so many more teams in Florida. So they got two teams joining them in 61 and 62. In 61, the Angels moved to Palm Springs, California, which is kind of on the border of Arizona. And they played half their games in California, half their games in Arizona. The following year in 62, the Colt 45s moved to Apache Junction, Arizona, which is near Phoenix. But the Colt 45s, they only lasted 2 years in Arizona before moving to Florida in 63. And in 65, they changed their name to the Astros, and they're still in Florida. Like I said, they're probably a West Coast team, but they ended up in Florida. So the Cactus League gives a little bit, they get two teams, and then one of them leaves a couple years later. 1962, the same year that the Colt 45s joined, the New York Mets are added as an expansion team to replace the Dodgers and Giants, who left New York for California in the 1950s, and they start spring training in Florida, and they're now in Port St. Lucie, Florida. 1965 to 77, there's a lot of expansion going on as well. 65, the Cubs moved from Arizona to Long Beach, California, so they're still kind of going back and forth to California. I mean, at the time, it made a lot of sense. Now it doesn't make sense just because of the cost of it. And there's just not a lot of real estate either. But in 65, they do move to California. In 65 as well, the Red Sox moved from Scottsdale, because they were in Arizona for a little bit, to Winter Haven, Florida. And they're still in Florida today. Obviously, the Yankees and Red Sox are on the East Coast. In 67, the Cubs returned to Arizona. And they go to Scottsdale instead of Mesa, although they did end up at Mesa today. So they pretty much just took over for the Red Sox when the Red Sox left. 69, the expansion Seattle Pilots and the San Diego Padres start spring training in Arizona. So there's two more teams are added to the league. Two more teams are given to the Cactus League because teams are starting to be built out on the West Coast because they have plenty of East Coast teams. They need some West Coast teams. So, of course, Cactus League are going to be getting first dibs. And they were actually able to hold on to these two this time instead of them moving away. Although, a quick little side note, the 1970 season, as I mentioned, it would take, what did I say, 60, 70 years before the Milwaukee Brewers get a team again, right? After that 1901 season, when they moved to, I'm drawing a blank, I had to go back in the timeline. But the Brewers do finally get their team back in the 1970s. The Pilots started the season as the Seattle Pilots. They were bankrupt, and they sold themselves in the middle of spring training. So the players came in as Seattle Pilots, and they left spring training as Milwaukee Brewers. And that's a big difference between Milwaukee and Seattle. And that had to have been one crazy camp for all of those involved. The Padres that year in 69 decided to start training in Yuma, which is super hot. If you guys think Phoenix is hot, Yuma is very, very hot on the California border over there. But they moved to Peoria in 1994, which they remain today. 69 also saw the A's move back to Mesa, Arizona, and they're the Oakland A's at this time. So the Cactus League is starting to get a little bit of momentum. They're starting to crawl themselves back into there. 69 expansion Kansas City Royals, the same year, they go to the Grapefruit League. So the Cactus League gets a couple teams. Grapefruit League, they also get a team. And that's kind of how it goes for a little bit. But the Cactus League does slowly crawl itself back to where it's at. 1977, Seattle is given another chance, right? 7 years after they lost the Pilots, after 1 year to Milwaukee, Seattle gets the Mariners. And the Mariners, as you know, stuck around. And they moved to Tempe to play in Tempe Diablo, which is the oldest stadium used in the Cactus League. It's now used by the Angels. And they still play in Arizona to this day. 77, again, Cactus League gets a team, so it's only right that the Grapefruit team gets a league as well because the Toronto Blue Jays join the rest of the teams in Florida down there. Fast forward, because nothing really happens in the 80s. There's a couple shufflings between different stadiums, but most of the teams stay in Florida or Arizona at the time. So you fast forward to 1992, when this is again, you start to get a little bit more expansion teams going on. 1992, the Indians leave Tucson for Winter Haven, Florida. So they were the original team in 47 with the Giants to join Arizona. They were the first team in Tucson to hike Corbett. They decided in 1992 that they're going to leave to go play in Winter Haven, Florida. And the crazy story about this is they weren't even initially planning on going to Winter Haven, Florida. They had plans to go to a different city in Florida. That city was destroyed by a hurricane. So they were reversing course and talking about moving back to Tucson. Well, the city of Tucson had already promised that stadium High Corbett, because at the second that they decided to leave, it was announced that the Colorado Rockies would become an expansion team the following year, 1993. Well, the city of Tucson promises High Corbett Field to the Colorado Rockies. So Indians reverse course again, and they end up in Winter Haven, Florida for a little bit. The expansion Colorado Rockies in 1993, as mentioned, they move into High Corbett Field. They took over for the Indians. Also at the same time, because it's got to go back and forth, the Florida Marlins joined the Grapefruit League teams at the same year. And the Rockies join Tucson. So you have the Marlins go to Florida, right, which is just another team added to the Florida League. The Indians left the year before to Florida, so they got another one back then. The Rockies joined Tucson, and they didn't want to have the same thing happen to them as happened to the Indians. So what happened to the Indians is they were the only team in Tucson. All these other teams are in Phoenix. It's a lot of travel for them. They wanted Tucson to promise that they're going to add at least one, if not two more teams to Tucson in order for them to play there instead of getting a spring training facility in Phoenix, which they probably would have been best for them. So in 1998, Tucson finally delivers on that. And the Chicago White Sox moved back to Arizona, and the expansion Arizona Diamondbacks joined them in the brand new facility, Tucson Electric Park in Tucson, Arizona. And now it's Keno Sports Complex. That was the first actual spring training game I've ever been to. One of my favorite memories growing up is one of my freshman year, we went down to watch a spring training game, and I don't remember if the first game was at High Corbett Field or at Tucson Electric Park, but we went and watched the game, and then our car broke down as we're leaving Tucson. And if you know Tucson, we're heading southeast. We're heading east back to where we live in Morenci, Arizona, and Tucson Electric Park, Keno Parkway, is like right there off the freeway as you're heading out of town. So our car breaks down, and we end up staying in one of the hotels right there, and our car's down for a day or for 2 days. We're stuck there. So we all jump in. I don't remember what happened. I don't know if the dealership or the mechanics, the shop gave us a ride or how we got a ride. But we ended up at Tucson Electric Park the next day watching another baseball game. One of the Diamondbacks players hit a grand slam. We won a grand slam breakfast from Denny's that day. And it was a fun trip for me and my brothers. Not so much for my parents. And it must have been a very stressful weekend for them. But it's one of my favorite memories of spring training as far as that goes. And Tucson Electric Park is a really nice stadium. It's no longer being used for spring training, as we'll get into, but it is a nice spring training facility. But with those moves, the Diamondbacks being added and the White Sox moving back to Arizona, that moves the Cactus League's numbers up to 10. So they're slowly crawling their ways back into this race. They're no longer being just completely trounced by the Grapefruit League. 1998, the same year, again, back and forth. The Tampa Bay Rays are also added, right? Same year as Diamondbacks, and they join the Grapefruit League ranks. Obviously, they live in Florida. So, Cactus League moves up to 10. Florida also gets the league, a new team. 2003, the Kansas City Royals and the Texas Rangers leave Florida to get a shared stadium in Surprise, Arizona. And now the Cactus League is really starting to make themselves back into it. They're up to 12 teams, and it's getting really close now. 2009, the Dodgers leave Dodgertown in Vero Beach, Florida to join the White Sox that are leaving Tucson after 11 years to go to Camelback Ranch in Glendale, Arizona. I've been to that one many times. Beautiful facilities. And that moves it up to 13 teams in the Cactus League, 11 of those teams in the Phoenix area. Also in 2009, the Indians returned to Arizona to camp in Goodyear. That moves it up to 14 teams in Arizona. So they're right there, 14 and 16, 12 in the Phoenix area. The following year, so in 2009, the Indians moved to Goodyear. 2010, their fellow Ohio team, the Cincinnati Reds, moved to Goodyear as well, leaving Sarasota, Florida. And that 2010 is the first official year that it was split evenly between the Cactus League and the Grapefruit League at 15 apiece. In And then the following year, 2011, was the last drop for Tucson. And the Arizona Diamondbacks and Colorado Rockies leave Tucson for Salt River Fields and Talking Stick in Scottsdale, Arizona. That gives Phoenix area, Maricopa County, all 15 Cactus League teams. And for the first time since 1947, Tucson no longer had a major league team camp there. So it was it was a sad year, bittersweet year, because again, we used to go to Tucson. Tucson was the easier of them. Phoenix spring training is still pretty easy, but Tucson was even easier for us. It was so much more kickback. But I will say, Salt River Fields and Talking Stick, beautiful facilities. I've been to that one. That one and Camelback Ranch for the Dodgers, probably the two I've been to the most. In fact, the week before the closed down spring training, my wife and I and my brother and his friend, we all decided to make a impromptu trip down to watch a game, and we ended up watching the Diamondbacks and the Indians. We got to see Madison Bumgarner. Francisco Lindor took him deep for a 3-run home run. We got to see a lot of major leaguers. We got to see both the Ketel Marte and Starling Marte, David Peralta, a lot of cool names, cool guys to go see. And that's kind of what spring training is. You get to see all these guys up close and personal, and you're a lot closer, it feels like, to me, than during the regular season. We pulled in the parking lot. We got picked up by a golf cart. They drove us right up to the front of the gate. We were able to walk in right there on top of the field. And again, I love spring training. I can rave about it all the time. And I know this doesn't replace spring training, but hopefully this guys gives you kind of a bit of a reprieve to go over the history of spring training. And that's kind of all that's happened since then. The only thing that's really happened after that 2011 season, when the teams became even, was that the Chicago Cubs, they moved from Mesa, right, from Holcomb Stadium in Mesa to Sloan Park in Mesa, which is a brand new facility, another beautiful one I've been to a few times. They try to make it look like a little Wrigley. It's really cool. Again, I highly recommend spring training in Arizona. I haven't done the Florida one, Grapefruit League. That is definitely on my list of things to do. Haven't done it yet, but I love the Arizona spring training. After the Cubs moved to Sloan Park, the Oakland A's leave Phoenix Municipal Stadium to go play in Holcomb Stadium in Mesa, and Phoenix Muni is now being used by Arizona State for their facilities. Also happening after that time was I don't know if there's two different ones. I think it's just this one. I think it's just Fidem Ballpark of the Palm Beaches in West Palm Beach, Florida, was built in 2017 for the Washington Nationals and the Houston Astros. And the funny thing about that, they get a brand new stadium in 2017. 2 years later, 2019, they're playing each other in the World Series. So you know that the beginning of the 2020 spring training this year, before all this went down, was a lot of fun. And it was because we get to watch it, right? That was kind of fun start spring training because they do share a complex with each other. But that'll do it for the timeline for spring training. I hope you guys enjoyed that part of it. And that'll do it for this episode of the YouTube version of episode 19, spring training edition, pod hacks only. Episode 20 should be out by the end of the week if all things go in the way I hope they go. I'm not under quarantine from work, so I don't get the free time. But I should still have enough time with everything to get that out to you guys. And I will have a little bit more. Usually I end some of my podcasting episodes with a top 10 list. I don't have one for this one. This one is even a little bit more abbreviated than the podcasting version. And I highly recommend going and checking out the podcast version and subscribing to that as well as this, because I'm going to have a few different things happening as they both grow and expand. And I have a lot more things in the works coming up soon that I hope you guys really enjoy. I've actually talked to a couple different podcasters about doing maybe some cross promoting, and I'm actually really excited about that. So as soon as that is done, I will let you guys know, and I'll let you guys know on my Twitter, JustAReyes13, on my Instagram, JustAReyes, and if I can get it all going and working, and I'm learning this side of it too on my website, justareyes.com. Again, the best place to reach me is my Instagram, justareyes, or at info@justareyes.com, or my other email, my backup email, info.justareyes@gmail.com. And they will all be in the episode description. As I mentioned before, please remember to like and subscribe. Please give me your feedback. I really do enjoy all of it. I really do hope you guys enjoy this video. I'm excited to see what the finished product is.